Okay, before we start, this class, I mean, it is recorded, but quite frankly, since the numbers of participants seems to be dropping, I suspect that's because people are just relying on the recording. If, quite frankly, if that's the case, I'm doing these recordings as an accommodation, to allow you perhaps to hear it again if you want, but if this is the way it's going to be, then I'm really going to stop recording it, and you're going to have to participate by actually being available at 11 o'clock on Tuesday and Thursday for the Zoom session. Okay, so what I want to do today is the following: just spend a couple of minutes more on some of the aspects of weapons and so on of World War I, and then we're moving on to the Eastern Front. And in addition to what's on the syllabus, there's a very short documentary, basically, that I'm going to show you at some point, because we're going to be talking about the Battle of Tannenberg, a very important battle in the Eastern Front. So it's a brief documentary that talks about what happened first in Belgium in 1914 when the war began, which we've already discussed, but it can't hurt to hear a review of it. And then it goes on to discuss what happened on the Eastern Front in the beginning of the war, the Battle of Tannenberg. The Battle of Tannenberg, as you'll see, has great symbolic significance and meaning for the Germans. And that's going to be true also of the Battle of Verdun that we'll talk about in a subsequent class. The Battle of Verdun had great symbolism for the French. Very often, emotion and history have a great effect and influence on how the war proceeds, how particular battles are fought, especially when those battles like Tannenberg and Verdun harken back to previous wars and the outcomes there. Usually, those outcomes were not good, obviously, for one side, and that side now wants to avenge what happened previously. So we'll talk more about that when we get to it, but that's the case with the Battle of Tannenberg. Getting back to the issue of the weapons and so on of World War I, we spoke about the significant developments, the tanks, the submarines, and of course, chemical warfare. Also important, in fact, very important in terms of World War I and then into World War II for other reasons, was the use of railways, the railway system, of which the Germans had a very, very well organized and very efficient system of railways. In fact, the Allies in World War I had a feeling that things were going to go the way they went because the Germans built these huge rail depots, or marshalling yards, as they're known, on the border of Germany and Belgium. Why would they suddenly have all of these rail depots and all these marshalling yards? It's like, well, okay, if you can still remember back to when we actually attended class at Lehman, there's the rail yards. I guess they're further set north of Lehman, but you see the unending numbers of trains, of subways that are just lined up there, and then they're dispatched to wherever and whenever they are. Same thing here. The Germans just suddenly marshaled all of these railway cars right at the border of Belgium. So the Allies knew railways are going to be an important part of World War I. And we know that in connection with the von Schlieffen Plan, because that plan, although it failed, anticipated a quick victory in France on the Western Front and in Belgium, and then moving everyone, that is all the soldiers and munitions and everything else, to the Eastern Front, and you do that by railway. So the Germans had this great system and this great railway timetable. Everything was very efficient and so on. And armies can only advance at the pace at which their mobile units move. So if you have a quick rail system, you can move your troops up front to to where you want them on the front lines very quickly. And then they just go the last few kilometers, whatever, by foot, because the trains don't stop exactly at the front, on the battle lines, but somewhere nearby, and then the troops are dispatched and move forward. So as I said, the Germans had this down to a fine art and a science. The Russians didn't. Russian rail system was very inefficient, and the Russians had a problem with Russia's a huge country, and the gauges on the tracks changed, and so all of a sudden the trains couldn't go any further. So it was a great advantage that the Germans had. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is mining. The Germans had a great advantage in terms of their mining capabilities. They were able to use the dry chalk ground of the Somme in the north of France. They were able to actually go through. It was very suited for mining operations. And even in the wetlands of Belgium, they had these pumps that could drain out all of the water and so on, and they could dig deeply and mine deeply into the ground in Belgium. What was the advantage of that? It was known as sapping. I think we already spoke about it. They could then dig tunnels under no man's land and hopefully reach underneath the enemy trenches or close to, and inflict all kinds of damage on the enemy lines. So mining was also a very important part of the effort in World War I, and that together with the rail system was in many ways determinative of the outcome in those early days of the war. Sadly, the use of railways in World War II had another aspect, more deadly and inhumane aspect. You'll see when we talk about the war in the East and Russia, a very interesting sideline to that with respect to a minority group within Russia, but also that same minority group was targeted in Germany at a certain point. And World War I was in many ways a dress rehearsal for World War II. And World War I, as you'll see when we get to the end, never really ended. It didn't have a satisfactory conclusion. So World War II was inevitable. And there's so many foreshadowings in World War I that became realities in World War II. But more about that later on. So we spoke about the Western Front, the stalemate, the Battle of the Marne, all of the consequences of that, the trench warfare, and a very long, prolonged World War I. Okay, you see in front of you a map of the Eastern Front, and you can access that also on Blackboard under course materials. So this was the Eastern Front from 1914 until 1918, although, as you'll see, the Russians were out of this in 1917. And you see it's a pretty large area. It extends all the way from the Baltic Sea in the north, all the way down to the Black Sea in the south, from the Adriatic Sea, all the way through the Balkan states, Austria-Hungary, even Turkey to a degree is part of this Eastern Front, although Turkey also figures into the war in the Middle East as well. So it's a huge area, and of course Russia, as we mentioned many times, it was a huge empire extending from Europe. Moscow, the capital, is actually on the continent of Europe. Going to the other end, the eastern end of Russia, you're in Asia. Vladivostok, the port city, is on the Pacific. It's an Asian port. So it was a huge front. And so that's the Eastern Front, or the Ostfront, as it was known in German. I'm afraid I don't speak Russian, so I can tell you what the Russian name is, was a theater of operations that extended across the major portion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire. It included Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it was huge. But as you see, it's different dynamic than the Western Front. Trench warfare wasn't really an aspect of fighting the Eastern Front. The Germans, remember, had their von Schlieffen plan. The French had their Plan 17. And the Russians had their plan. Already in 1910, a Russian general by the name of Danilov developed what was known as Plan 19. And that was the Russian war plan for an eventual conflict. And the whole Russian plan, the whole really strategy of Russia was obviously to break through, to get to Berlin, move their troops forward to get to the German capital of Berlin. In order to do that, they had to go through East Prussia. All right, now if you look at the map, East Prussia isn't specifically delineated, but if you see that town on the Baltic, Königsberg, so Königsberg is in East Prussia. And East Prussia is the furthest east province of the German Empire. And in order to get from Russia, to get your troops through to Germany, to break through, you have to go through East Prussia. But that means you also have to go through parts of Austria-Hungary. And that part of Austria-Hungary, which was significant, is an area known as Galicia, G-A-L-I-Z-I-A. Nowadays, Galicia is part of Poland. But in 1914, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, by the way, sort of interesting side point, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was extraordinarily diverse in its population, and which is why some of these problems arose, right? Because of different ethnic and religious and other groups within the empire that wanted their independence. Galicia was one of those areas in the Austro-Hungarian Empire that historically had belonged to Poland. After World War I, it became Poland again. Of course, in World War II, the Germans occupied it, but it's Poland again. But what's interesting is while it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914, its population was quite diverse. A lot of the population spoke Polish. A lot of the population was Jewish, and a very unique Jewish population. It was not totally, but to a great degree, an area that saw many, many communities of Hasidic Jews. So it was a very diverse area, but that had consequences, as you'll see later on. So it was a plan that the Russians had conceived of moving their troops through these different areas, heading towards East Prussia, which was Germany, and then breaking down the German forces in East Prussia, moving forward further west, ultimately to get to Berlin. Didn't happen. It didn't happen for a number of reasons. But the fact is that the Russian army failed, first of all, to take Warsaw, which is the capital of Poland. Warsaw was on the way, and the Russian army failed in its attempt to conquer and occupy Warsaw, which was one stumbling block. The other problem, and Story in his History of World War I points it out, because it's focused on the different geographic aspects of this war and how they impacted on the troop movements and so on. And in order, the Russians thought, to be successful in this march westward, they would have to break up their army into separate groups. And breaking up your army into separate groups is never a good thing. You know, united we stand and divided we fall. And indeed, the strategy of the Russians to break up into different forces weakened their frontal assault. In the beginning, they had to deal also with the Austro-Hungarian army, not a great army. Ultimately, the Austro-Hungarian army collapsed as well, but in the initial phases of the Eastern War, the war on the Eastern Front, the Austro-Hungarian army still had some successes against the Russians. Now, you have to understand other issues that affected the effectiveness of Russia. Russia, like I said, was a huge country. And if you remember back to our discussion of the von Schlieffen plan, part of the plan was based on the idea that the Russians would take forever to move their troops all the way across a huge country, all the way across to the western part of Russia in order to engage the German and Austrian armies. So that was one problem for the Russians, not as big a problem as the Germans anticipated, but you have to move all of these troops. Certainly had, in terms of numbers, the Russians were in great shape because it's a huge country with a huge population and it was an autocratic regime and you didn't choose to go to the army. You were sent to the front, but you had to get there. And like I said, the Russian rail system wasn't as efficient as the Germans. So the problem was moving the troops. And a big problem was the loyalty or lack of loyalty amongst the Russian troops. After all, the vast majority of Russia during this imperial time, when it was still the Russian Empire, right, the Romanov dynasty, the Romanovs lived very well. The aristocracy lived very well. There was a certain layer of the clergy that had pretty decent living conditions. The majority of Russians were peasants. In fact, Russia had really just recently stepped up from serfdom to peasantry, right? Before this, most of the Russians were serfs. They were indentured servants. They were bound to the land. They were slaves. And their lives were miserable, right? With no expectation of a better future. That doesn't exactly breed loyalty and devotion to Mother Russia. Right? So these troops weren't exactly wholeheartedly embracing this war effort. And so lack of morale, it's a big issue in any war. If you don't have the support and the dedication of your citizenry, you're probably not going to do too well. So that was yet another issue. Then on top of that, the Russians were very backward. I mean, they were starting to industrialize, but they were far behind the Western European countries. And that meant they were far behind in the production of all of the necessary components of waging war. So much so, they didn't have enough weapons. And they were sending troops to the front unarmed in many cases, or they had to share rifles. And then there was a shortage of ammunition, if you had the rifle. So all of these issues obviously did not bode well for Russian success in World War I. Underneath all of this, and it's a separate topic we'll get to the next time, was a festering general hatred of the regime. In 1905, the Russians had their first revolution. There was actually a Russian revolution in 1905, but it failed. Why was there a revolution in 05? I mean, this is building up. Obviously, life in Russia was not ever particularly good for the vast majority. But in 1905, I mentioned it before, the Russians engaged in a war against the Japanese. Now, theoretically, the Japanese should have been massacred by the Russians in terms of size and in terms of everything else, because as backward as Russia was, Japan at that time was even further back. It was a feudal nation. It hadn't emerged from the Middle Ages, really. Should have lost the war, but it didn't. And I explained why. It had the financing of Jacob Schiff, the Wall Street banker, and so on. But somehow or other, the Japanese managed to defeat the Russians. That was a tremendous blow for Russia. And that fermented further hatred and bitterness of the regime. So in 1905, there was an attempt to overthrow it with a revolution. The revolution didn't succeed. Although the government then said, okay, we're going to make some changes and reforms, and we're going to make life easier and more democratic. They didn't. It was a joke. But there was still the lingering effect of having lost a war in 1905. And now it's only not, 9 years later or whatever, and they hadn't really recovered. And they certainly hadn't advanced much industrially, Russia. So all of these things were an issue that did not bode well for a successful encounter with a country like Germany, which was at the forefront, really, of industrialization and modernization and everything else, not to mention its military superiority. It always had a military advantage because it was a military state. It was, as you remember, conceived and emerged because of various wars. So all in all, not a good situation for the Russians. Then there was the other issue, which we didn't really talk about much, although it came up a bit when we talked about the rape of Belgium. Propaganda played a huge role in World War I. You have to understand, this is 1914. There was no mass media in the way we know it. And to the extent that there was news coverage, it was mostly the press, newspapers, and they were controlled in these autocratic nations, even Germany. I mean, it was to a great extent dictatorship, had a great more democracy and civilian participation, let's say, than Russia, but it was an empire with an emperor, and there was strict control. And what was published in the newspapers is what the government wanted published in the newspapers. So this component of World War I culture was great, and it tried to arouse passion and loyalty and enthusiasm. That was true in the West, and it was true in Russia as well. And the Russian propagandists portrayed this war as a sort of life and death conflict with the Germans threatening the very existence of Russia. And they thought that way they would, arouse some enthusiasm and some feeling amongst the masses to embrace this war. The German plan, remember, was the von Schlieffen Plan, which failed for a number of reasons. And therefore, the quick and efficient destruction of the Russian Empire by the German army didn't happen. It was stymied. The Russians had also fought a number of other wars along the way, which also weakened their military strength and obviously further contributed to what was going to be a very unsuccessful attempt at a war that would turn in their favor. The Russians had an interest, however, in developments in the Balkan states in Eastern Europe. Mentioned earlier on, the Balkan states were basically Slavic entities, and the Russians felt a sort of paternal obligation. I mean, they were Mother Russia, which I guess is a maternal obligation, but they felt that the autonomy and the independence of these Balkan states was threatened. After all, at one time, the Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire, controlled the Balkans. Then the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled parts of the Balkans. That's why the famous assassination in Sarajevo. So the Russians felt an obligation to stand up for their Serb and Slavic neighbors, especially Serbia, and therefore they felt a certain indebtedness and a certain, like I said, obligation really to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The Austrians wanted to protect what they still had in the Balkan states. So Austria-Hungary was always an issue for Russia, both ways. And therefore, they had to prepare, even though, as I said, the circumstances were not particularly favorable based on the previous experiences Russia had had in the different wars it fought, and even that one against the Japanese. Before 1914, Russia had no success in terms of its diplomatic attempts in Europe. And it had no success in its military attempts as well. And the Russians felt that the only way they can move forward is to engage the support of the workers. But this is before the revolution, and the workers were not sympathetic to a Russian government that was not particularly in tune to their needs and to their issues. So just prior to World War I, let's say 1913, 1914, and so on, the Russian government, which was then located in St. Petersburg, I think now St. Petersburg again, for a while there was Leningrad, St. Petersburg, the capital, was concerned really with the internal weaknesses of Russia at the time, not particularly focused on extending itself outwardly, with diplomatic overtures to the rest of Europe. So in some ways it was isolated, and the constant threat that the Russians perceived coming from Germany further weakened Russia's position. Ultimately, the Russians attempted, as I said, this invasion of East Prussia. That was the beginning of the war. And the idea was that by entering East Prussia, the easternmost province of Germany, they would then be able to subdue the German march forward into Russia. But that's not what transpired, right? In fact, the Eastern Front in the beginning for the Germans was actually quite a success story. You'll see one real success after another, in part because of the weaknesses, not only in the structure of Russia, but the military planning of the Russians. For Russia, the road, like I said, the road to Berlin was through East Prussia. And that being the easternmost part of the German Empire, obviously that was the gateway. But that was also a formidable obstacle that they had to get through. The Russians had two armies, the first Russian, the second Russian army. And the first Russian army was under the control of a general by the name of Pavel von Rennenkampf. I think we have a picture of him somewhere, do we? No, we only have Brusilov. By the way, this is Tsar Nicholas II, who was, of course, the autocratic ruler of Russia. And as you'll see, as the Russian military attempt failed, he took over. Ultimately, he became the guy in charge of all military decision-making in World War I. Another disaster because he was not a military man. His brother actually had for a while been in charge, but he was a colossal failure as well. And that's when Tsar Nicholas took over all of the operations. Now, the Russian First Army under Rennenkampf had about 200,000 soldiers. And the Second Army, the Russian Second Army, under Alexander Samsonov, we see a picture of him somewhere. Here he is. Had also a considerable number, about 150,000. Not nearly as great, let's say, as the German military force, but a substantial force nonetheless. Problem was, as I said, the Russians decided that the way to achieve the breakthrough in East Prussia was to divide the two armies, attacking from two different positions. As I said earlier on, united we stand, divided we fall. To divide your force, separate your forces is never a good military move. And in fact, you saw that writ large, really, in terms of the von Schlieffen plan, because it was also, it was a two-front plan. This was not a two-front plan to the extent that the von Schlieffen plan was, but in many ways it was. It was a two-pronged attack on East Prussia. So it was not well conceived and doomed. But one of the reasons that the Russians had to do this was based on an issue that William Story emphasizes in his History of World War I that we have. Geography plays a big role. And European geography is quite diverse. You know, there are the flatlands, and then the great mountains, and then there are the swamps, and then there are the forests. And so the geography of Europe, being as diverse as it is, plays a major role in how a war is going to play out. And that was certainly the case in the East, on the Eastern Front. Why? Because on the one hand, you have the Masurian Lakes, so lake region of Russia, which you'll have to traverse on the way to East Prussia. You can't send troops over huge lakes. You know, this is very, it was an area of Russia that was dominated really by different bodies of water, and those created impediments, that created obstacles to going straight. So on the one hand, that Russian army, one army had to go around the Masurian Lakes. On the other hand, there was the forests of Russia, and Russia actually had one of the only remaining primeval forests in Europe. And the other army then had to negotiate around this forested area. So necessarily they had to split up into these two groups and undermine the power that they would have had if they were one united, unified unit. What happened was that this is a logistical mistake, as I said, a geographic mistake, really. And when the German armies started encircling these Russian armies, the Russian commander at the time, a guy by the name of that was Samsonov, realized that his army was encircled, was basically stopped dead in their tracks, and that there was nothing he could do. That the Germans did. I mean, they just killed and took prisoner tremendous numbers of Russian soldiers. But Samsonov really didn't want to have to tell the Tsar, you know, I just messed up and it's all over. So he did what he felt he had to do under the circumstances to avoid the wrath of Nicholas II. He marched himself off into a forest and shot himself through the head and committed suicide and didn't have to deal with the whole issue. So that was one unfortunate casualty of the Russian military advance. The German general who was charged with dealing with the Eastern Front at the time was a guy named Maximilian von Prittwitz. But he mistakenly thought that the Russian army was going to surround his troops, and he retreated. There's no such thing as retreat in the German army, right? This was true in the Second World War with the Battle of Moscow and then the Battle of Stalingrad, when Paulus, Walter von Paulus, the German general, suggested in a message to Berlin, we have to retreat, and Hitler and his general said, no, we don't retreat in the German army. So he was just replaced by someone else. But yes, it's true. It's true of every dictatorship. You don't tell the boss, you know, the dictator, the emperor, that we're in trouble. You just, I guess, have to do what Samsonov did and commit suicide and get out of that. But the German army now was in a far better position, and it was advancing at a rather impressive pace. And the Russian army basically was stalled. The other general was Brusilov. No, it's not him. It's Brusilov. Where is it? No, it's not. There he is. Alexei Brusilov. He actually, for a while, was successful in leading his troops forward towards East Prussia, but again, they were stopped, and the advance failed. One of the important battles, and we're going to see a brief documentary on it, was, like I said, a very important I would say, moral as well as military victory for the Germans. And that was the Battle of Tannenberg, Tannenberg, which was fought in 1914. So the early battles, and it was one of the early successes of the German army. In fact, it was fought in August 26th through 30th, 1914, really early on in the war, which is why in the documentary I'm going to show you there's a parallel between what happened in Russia, the beginning of the von Schlieffen, in Belgium, at the beginning of the von Schlieffen Plan, what happened in Russia at the Battle of Tannenberg, because there's sort of parallel early events within the war, and there's sort of one was in the west, one in the east, sort of bookends to the early days of the war. It was, for the Germans, a remarkable victory. It meant almost the total defeat of Russian forces at this battle. And that, in fact, is when Samsonov decided to take his life. Then there were the following battles. The first battle of the Masurian Lakes, as I mentioned, the Lakey area, and then the various other battles that followed. The Russian army did move relatively quickly under Brusilov, but again, they were stopped ultimately in their quest to break the lines and go into East Prussia. What was important about the Battle of Tannenberg is the following. It had a great, like I said, historical importance for Germany and for German history. The truth is, the Battle of Tannenberg actually wasn't fought in Tannenberg. It was fought in a place called Allenstein, or Olstein. I guess it's the Russian name. Allenstein, the German. So why would you call it the Battle of Tannenberg when it wasn't fought in Tannenberg? At that point in time, the Kaiser appointed a new general with an adjunct to fight in the east. Who was it? It was Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg was actually a retired general. He fought in previous wars, but they called him out of retirement, and he led the German troops early on in this Eastern Front, together with a guy by the name of Ludendorff, Erich von Ludendorff. Where is it? It's not Ludendorff. It's not Ludendorff. It's here somewhere. I'll find it. Anyway, this is a scene, artist's rendition of the Battle of Tannenberg. So Ludendorff and Hindenburg then took over the German forces at this battle on the Eastern Front. Ludendorff decided he's going to call this the Battle of Tannenberg, even though Tannenberg was about 30 kilometers away. Why? Because 500 years earlier, the Germans suffered a terrible defeat against, these were the Teutonic Knights, fighting against these Slavic forces, and they were defeated. It's exactly 500 years earlier at the Battle of Tannenberg. That was the 1400s Battle of Tannenberg. So now that the Germans successfully routed the Russian army, it was payback time. Hindenburg thought, okay, we're going to finally have our revenge for that humiliating defeat of the Teutonic Knights, right? And now we've come back to this part of the world and we've enjoyed a tremendous success. I'm going to call it the Battle of Tannenberg. That Battle of Tannenberg in World War I was always being touted and voiced by Hitler and his followers as this great German victory in the First World War, even though the Germans lost the First World War, and we'll see who they blame that on later on. So that's how it became known as the Battle of Tannenberg. What became of Hindenburg? Right now he's a big war hero again on the Eastern Front. Basically, what happens with great war heroes happens in this country also sometimes. They become the leader of the nation. Right? And so, indeed, Hindenburg became the president of Germany. during the Weimar Republic, the years between World War I and World War II, 1920s. But the thing was, by that point in time, he was old and doddering and, somewhat, not in control of his game anymore. But he was around as president of Germany when Hitler became the chancellor of Germany. And Hindenburg was outraged. He thought Hitler was a fool. He was a nothing in the army. He was like a corporal. He had no real rank of significance. And Hindenburg was opposed to it, but there was nothing that could be done anymore. And so Hitler became the chancellor. Not long after that, Hindenburg died. And we all know what followed that. Right? So that was the Battle of Tannenberg. What I'd like to do now is show you a brief documentary. It's our friend again from these other short World War I documentaries. And again, it will focus on both what's known as the Rape of Belgium and then the Battle of Tannenberg.
The war progressed in Belgium, France, and Serbia. The Austrian and German High Command either sanctioned or ignored the widespread execution and rape of civilians. A shocked and revolted world looked on. My name is Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. Here's where we stood on the battlefields of Europe at the beginning of the week. In the West, there were 3 German armies, 750,000 men. The left flank was in Lorraine, and the rest were marching through Belgium at 30 kilometers per day, an amazing speed, and pretty much slaughtering the French armies they encountered. And the British Expeditionary Force under John French was approaching from the west. In the east, the Germans were on the retreat out of East Prussia, and the Russians were advancing. Now, in the west, after all the victories of the past few weeks, things were looking good for the Germans, but their reputation was doing anything but that. And the atrocities the German troops committed against civilians in the West grew and grew. In Dinant, German soldiers repairing a bridge were fired on by a few Belgian civilians, and as a reprisal, over 600 Belgian men, women, and children were shot. On August 20th, it happened in Andenne. There was even a printed announcement from German General von Bülow, posted in Liège, that read the following. The population of Andenne, after manifesting peaceful intentions towards our troops, attacked them in the most treacherous manner. With my authorization, the general who commanded these troops has reduced the town to ashes and shot 110 persons. In Tamim, 384 men were rounded up near the church and shot. In Rossignol, 122 people were executed for supposedly supporting the French army, who had just themselves been crushed there in battle. Now, there were dozens more such incidents, known collectively as the Rape of Belgium. But in Louvain, it was completely out of control. The Germans had occupied Louvain on August 19th, right? On the 25th, the Belgian army, coming from Antwerp, harassed the Germans. But once this was over, the German command decided the people of Louvain were to blame. So for the next 5 days, the German troops executed hundreds of citizens of both sexes, including many clergy, and burned the city, many of its famous medieval buildings. In the international press, there were horrible eyewitness accounts and even a headline in the New York Tribune, Germans sack Louvain, women and clergy shot. 10,000 civilians were driven from the city. In total, over 6,000 civilians are known to have been killed in cold blood in Belgium and France by Germans in the first weeks of the war. Now, I have to point out that some people today believe that the charges of war crimes against Germany in occupied Belgium and France are greatly exaggerated or even fabricated. But this is completely at odds with contemporary evidence. And it's important to note that these crimes were not only tolerated by military command, but in many cases, even sanctioned by them. Stories of German atrocities were particularly abundant in the British papers, where propagandists wanted to move away from the killing of an aristocrat in a faraway country to atrocities closer at hand in Belgium as a moral imperative for fighting the war. Now, this would motivate the British troops enormously when, on August 23rd, the Germans ran into the British for the first time in the war at the Battle of Mons. Now, the German High Command had been mocking the British Army for weeks and joking that they should just send the police to arrest them. But the British regulars, the only fully professional army in Europe before the war, held off the numerically superior Germans for many hours, inflicting 3 times the losses they took themselves. German howitzers arrived in the afternoon, though, with which the British artillery could not compete, and the British began to retreat, parallel to the French retreat, as the Germans quickly pushed through Belgium and slaughtered the unprepared French army. There was heavy fighting for the British along the retreat over the next few days, especially when they turned and held their ground on August 26 at Les Cateaux, long enough for thousands of men to withdraw in good order. A British general, Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, had decided to stop and fight as the Germans were so close and the rearguard divisions were becoming so scattered that a catastrophic battle was otherwise inevitable. Smith-Dorrien was a general who had seen a lot of action for over 30 years all over the world with the British colonial army. He knew what he was doing. Although the action that day would prove deadlier for the British army than the D-Day invasion 30 years later, Smith-Dorrien would give his army a 12-hour start on the Germans. But the troops were exhausted, and there was now even talk in the air that the war would indeed be over by Christmas, but with Germany the victor. Although on the Eastern Front, things to that point hadn't been going well at all for the Germans, especially after their recent defeat at Gumbinnen, which caused the German retreat. After this, German Army Chief of Staff von Moltke dismissed his paranoid General von Prittwitz and brought General von Hindenburg out of retirement to replace him. Now, Hindenburg had retired in 1911, but unlike many of the European generals so far this war, Hindenburg had seen action going as far back as the 1860s. Now, on the surface, things looked good for the Russians, right? But they had colossal logistic and communications problems. They didn't even encode their telegrams, so all wire communications could be monitored by anyone. And one tiny event occurred that had huge later repercussions. After the Battle of Gumbinnen, a note was found on a dead Russian officer that outlined most of the Russian plans for their offensive. Armed with this knowledge, Hindenburg and his second-in-command Ludendorff broke off the German retreat and decided to go on the attack. On August 24th, the Russians collided with the Germans, and the Russian center made great progress, but it was a complete illusion. On the 26th, the German western flank cut through the Russian left and cut off communications. And on the 27th, the German eastern flank did the same thing to the Russian right flank. The Russian army was trapped in the middle, running out of basically everything. And on August 28th, they began surrendering in droves, nearly 100,000 men, with 50,000 more killed or wounded over the course of only several days. This was the most spectacular defeat of the war and made Hindenburg a German national hero, even if much of the credit rightly belonged to the ironically named German General Francois. Now, there was a village nearby named Tannenberg, where in a medieval battle, the Slavs had defeated the Teutonic Knights, and this village gave its name to the battle, which would become a big symbol of German pride. This was a big moment because it put East Prussia now totally under German control. But further south, Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, was having huge difficulties with control, which the Austrian army used as an excuse for wartime atrocities of their own. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had launched this war in the first place to teach Serbia a lesson, or maybe even end her existence. So there was no love lost between the two. And when Austria-Hungary invaded, it provoked widespread Serbian civilian resistance to the invading army, guerrilla warfare. Now this really upset the Austrians, particularly their stuck-in-the-past aristocratic military leaders who wanted the war conducted on their terms, and they decreed that they would deal with civilian resistance ruthlessly. And they did, shooting, hanging, and bayoneting Serbian civilians, most of whom were innocent, men, women, and even children. But the Serbian guerrillas were good at creating chaos in the Austrian lines, often waiting for them to pass before sniping them with rifles from behind. This was effective, but it had its cost. An estimated 3,500 Serbian civilians were executed during just the first 2 weeks of the August campaign. And we have a lot of evidence of this because executing Serbian civilians was not something the Austrians tried to hide. In fact, Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf wanted people to see these punishments, so many of the executions of civilians were photographed and the photos were published. Mass executions and mass graves. Here we are at the end of the week, with Germany ascendant in both the East and the West, and a terrified citizenry, including over 1 million Belgians, fleeing from the invaders. Now, many formerly anti-war people decided this week that the war was, after all, justified, and that Germany must be stopped at all costs to preserve civilization in Europe. And we see, years later, that the massacres of civilians by the Germans in August 1914 were a direct factor in the harsh conditions imposed on Germany after the war, which indirectly, or maybe even directly, led to Nazism and the Second World War. That's all for this week. Click subscribe to get each and every episode. If you want more background information on our program or more history info about World War I,
Okay, few points. I hope all of you saw it. Few points to make. One, I mentioned it, but I want to clarify it again. Communications were a big deal in World War I, and the Russians didn't have it. Not only did they not have it, they were so sloppy and inexperienced in this regard that the Germans, as you saw, were able to encode every single plan the Russians had, including plans in some dead soldiers' pocket, which of course made it a lot easier for the Germans. Furthermore, we'll get to this later on in the course when we talk about the Middle East, but what you saw the Austro-Hungarian government perpetrating in Serbia in terms of unjustifiable mass murder of civilians is yet another aspect of the genocidal part of World War I. In fact, the term genocide came out of World War I. And the attacks against Belgian citizens, right, that was the first episode. What happened in the early days in Serbia, that was yet another indication of the brutality and barbarism. But what's coming up in the Middle East is by far worse, and that was the Armenian genocide, the massacre of Armenians, millions of Armenians by the Ottoman Empire, by the Turks, who of course were on the side of the Germans in World War I. And the truth is, and we'll talk more about it when we get to it, the Turks had a long-standing relationship with Germany, militarily and otherwise. And so these methods and these outrageous disregards for human life, the Ottoman Turks already saw in their dealings with Germany and their representatives in Berlin. This is World War I, right? But everything in World War I was a foreplay or a foreshadowing or a dress rehearsal for World War II. And of course, the massacre, the genocide, the Holocaust of World War II trumped even what the Ottoman Turks did in World War I, and is directly connected because, as Hitler pointed out, look, the Turks got away with genocide in World War I. It was the middle of a war. We can do this in the middle of World War II, middle of another war. And the truth is the Ottoman Turks and Turkey would never really but they were never called to task for what they did. Every time there was a motion in the United Nations to condemn what the Ottoman Turks did in the First World War, it never had a sufficient vote to pass. Why? Because the Turks kept saying, that wasn't us, that was the Ottoman Empire, we're the Turks. Well, guess what? Same country. So the different episodes of brutal bloodshed amongst civilian populations has its origins in World War I. And as was pointed out, that certainly colored the attitude of the West towards Germany, certainly the British, and they felt now justified in going to war. What's going to happen in World War I with respect to the United States is a build-up towards the U.S. entering the war. We'll talk more about that in detail, with the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram, and of course what already had happened in Belgium at the beginning of the war. So all of this is like I said, a frightening prophetic vision of even worse atrocity in World War II. Now, this leads to one other point I want to make, and it all ties in. History is really like a seamless web. The Russians, as you saw, suffered brutal losses. Ultimately, the ineffectiveness and the collapse of the Russian military attempts in World War I led to yet another revolution, this time in 1917, and this one successful. We'll talk about that separately the next time. That was the end of the Tsar, the end of the Romanov dynasty, and the beginning of the communist rule in Russia. So the Russians are out of the war. They weren't there for the end. They were done in 1917. But, you know, you always have to blame someone when you lose a war, right? Who do you blame? There always be a scapegoat. And you always pick the most visible and obvious and vulnerable group within that society to lay the blame on. It's fascinating how World War I is connected in two respects to this issue. When the Russians lost the war and suffered all the loss of life and destruction that they did, then a revolution, who are they going to blame it on? If you know anything about Russian history, it was obvious who they were going to blame it on. They were going to blame it on the Jews. The Jews in Russia always had a very lowly status. They were forced to live in what was known as the Pale of Settlement, a very restricted area. They were constantly subject to pogroms, to government-organized attacks on Jewish communities where innocent people were killed and brutalized. So, not surprisingly, World War I and the Russian defeat had to be blamed on someone, and the obvious scapegoat would, of course, be the Jews. In fact, during World War I, while the war was still going on, the Russian army, as it moved westward towards Germany, brutally attacked not only Jewish communities, destroyed Jewish businesses, pilfered everything they wanted, raped and brutalized. It was a horror. So much so that eventually the generals in the Russian army had to put a halt to it, to try and control it. Ironically, the German army, coming from the other side, this World War I, was mortified and outraged by what they saw the Russians doing to the Jews in the Russian, the Russian Empire. And so for the Jews in the Russian Empire, the Germans in World War I were the humane army and the progressive liberal force, which had an impact later on when World War II broke out, and now the Germans, the Nazis, right, were coming into Eastern Europe with their Einsatzgruppen, and the killing forces, and doing the same thing to the Jews in Russia and Poland that the Russians had done to their fellow Jews in World War I and before. But the end result, with the defeat of both of these countries, ultimately had the same effect. What happened? In Germany, it took 4 years. The Germans lost the war. They had to blame it on somebody. So who are they going to blame it on? Obviously, they're going to blame it on the Jews. And it became known as the famous German Dolchstoß, the stab in the back. You had to explain how a great military power like Germany could lose a war. It couldn't have been its military strength. No, it had to be that they were stabbed in the back. And who stabbed them in the back? They said the Jews stabbed them in the back. That's why they lost the war. Otherwise, they'd have won. And they came up with all of these incredible lies. The Jews didn't fight in the war. It wasn't true. German Jews fought in World War I in a greater percentage compared to the percentage of the population, even in the Germans, because they were great patriots, German Jews. And the loss of life was incredible. Not only that, but it was some of the outstanding figures in the various commercial, industrial aspects of German life that enabled the Germans even to fight a war. There was a guy by the name of Walter Rathenau. His father, Emil Rathenau, was the one who brought electricity to Germany. He was at the, I think it was the Paris World Fair, where they first introduced, this in the 1800s, the concept of using electricity to light cities and so on. In Germany, they hadn't done that yet. He came back and said, we're going to do this here. And he formed a corporation known as the AEG, Allgemeine Elektrische Gesellschaft. Became a mate, it was like Con Edison. Con Edison of Germany became a very wealthy man. He had one son, Walter Rathenau. Walter Rathenau was a brilliant young man who really wasn't interested in business and commerce. He was an intellectual. He had a number of PhDs, spoke a million languages, whatever. And when World War I broke out, he advised the Kaiser, the German emperor, the German Kaiser, how to effectively garner all of the material needs necessary for a total war. Ironically, had he not been successful, the war might not have lasted so long because the Germans wouldn't have been able to go on for 4 years. But he was the one who advised the German military on preparing, all the necessary natural resources and so on, and even armaments and uniforms and everything that now enabled the German army to fight a 4-year war. There was a guy named Albert Balin. He was a great shipping magnate. He was Jewish, and he advised the Kaiser about naval operations. But notwithstanding all this incredible contribution of German Jews to the war effort in World War I, when they lost the war in Germany, then they blamed the Jews. And in fact, it's a very interesting book by a guy named Tim Grady. It's called A Deadly Legacy, German Jews in the Great War. And it shows exactly how, with all of the patriotism, all of the loyalty to Germany that they showed, they wanted to be accepted finally as true patriots and so on. As long as things are going Germans' way, there was no problem. Once the war was lost, and of course they were the scapegoats, they were the ones who were blamed. So really parallel to what happened in Russia when the Russians lost the war. And to extend it yet one step further, African Americans who fought for the United States in World War I, of course in segregated units, also thought they were going to finally be accepted for their show of patriotism and loyalty, and they weren't. Not only were they not accepted, nor were the Jim Crow laws done away with or anything. When the troops came back from Europe, they intentionally had black soldiers held back on the ship until all the white soldiers got off, to basically give them the message that don't think you're now equal to the rest of us. And notwithstanding the contributions and the lives that were lost, in support of the U.S. war effort, same thing was true in World War II. Ironically, the president of the United States in World War I was a guy named Woodrow Wilson. He was a Democrat. He was a very progressive, liberal Democrat, except for one thing. He was a racist, an incredible racist, because the truth is, even though Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat and a liberal and the governor of New Jersey, right? He wasn't born in New Jersey. He was born in the South, in Virginia. And right after the Civil War, he carried with him all of the racist and, notions and prejudices that come along with the South. So amazing parallels in these three different armies, Russian, German, and American, right, when the war ended. So in our next class, we're going to go on with the war on the Eastern Front. I didn't dwell on the many battles we could have spoken about, but I wanted to condense it into the basic notion that the Russians didn't do too well for the reasons we pointed out, and were forced to exit the war because of a revolution back home. And that's the next topic, which is really a fascinating story, the 1917 Russian Revolution. And a very interesting figure by the name of Rasputin, some sort of religious fanatic, who was actually the advisor to the Romanovs. Phenomenal story. And although he told them in the beginning, don't go to war or you're finished, but they didn't listen to him in that instance. So that's what's coming up on Tuesday. So the Russian Revolution, the figure of Rasputin, and so on. Again, for those of you who are here, you don't need this message. For those who aren't, I guess we'll listen to the taped version. I really would like your presence on the Tuesday, Thursday Zoom 11 o'clock session. And if I see that there's no response in that regard and that the numbers are low, I'm afraid I'll just cease recording and really be forced, I guess, to attend in person. Any questions? Anything unclear? Okay, I hope you're keeping up with the reading in William's story. He has a very good synopsis also of what happened on the Eastern Front. So I'm assuming that you've read that as well. Take care, have a great weekend, and see you all on Tuesday, same time, same place.
All right, see you later, Professor.
Take care, stay safe, be well.
Same.